Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
So, hi, I'm Lee Rainey from Pew Internet. Pew is a family name. It's not an acronym. It's the family that found oil in Pennsylvania and shipped a lot of it, made a lot of money. It's the Sunoco fortune. So there's not an acronym behind me or anything like that. And actually, in a weird way, we're funded not to do any advocacy. We're not supposed to promote anything. We're not supposed to recommend anything. We're not supposed to cheerlead for any companies and stuff like that. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. And I took Liz's assignment and the general topic that we're supposed to discuss and tried to look at our data for examples of what would be rare in things like what we do and examples of what would be mysteries in things that we do, but you guys could help illuminate. And one of the sort of interesting challenges of this work is Pew has always been associated with big national phone surveys. That's a calling card for Pew Research for forever. And one of the most accidental, wonderful things that happened to Pew Internet as it came into being was we became like the default Census Bureau for digital statistics, which puts more and more burden on us to sort of benchmark and measure big phenomena and big things because for better or for worse, the Bush administration just decided not to continue on what the Clinton administration was doing in the 90s and doing wonderful, regular, fast turnaround, robust surveys. The Bush administration in about 2002 or 2003 did one major household survey, 50,000 households, as they do with the Census Bureau, and wrote a report about a year after they collected the data, so already the data were sort of suspect. And they wrote a report that basically said more than half the population was using home broadband. The market has solved the problem. We don't have to worry about this anymore. So now the Pew Internet data is pretty much the only data that you have for most of the 2000s about what was going on in broadband and mobile adoption and social media and things like that. So we feel the burden of that, and in some respects we're handing off lots of problems and interesting issues because we can't cover the things that maybe are of most interested people in this room. So I thought I'd talk about three ideas that emerge from our data about either rareness in what we find or mysteries in what we find. You can roughly categorize them as things that are outside our data, what we don't quite capture in the way that we capture it, things that are beyond our data, things that nothing a phone survey can possibly answer. And then there actually are things that are hidden in our data that for one reason or other we haven't extracted them or that aren't necessarily top of mind subjects for the kind of work that we do. So when you do big national surveys, one of the limits on it, no matter how great your sample is eventually you get to a point where you can't get good samples of every group that matters. So right now, our standard survey is about 2,000 people. We collect it over a month. We do not get enough Asian Americans in our sample to report those data as important race and ethnicity data. It's a frustration that drives our stakeholders wild, and eventually we will be able to do it, but there are small groups and subgroups, and not necessarily even small groups, that don't get captured in our data. So there are some subpopulations, starting with 7% of the population, that doesn't get reflected in the way that we report out our data, although one of the nice things you can do is combine our data sets and eventually get enough samples so that you can at least look at basic things with subpopulations. But for instance, it's a real limit on our work that we have to wait until something is likely to have been generally adopted by some portion of the population before we can pick it up. So early adopters of everything sort of never get covered in our work, and it's an enormous frustration to scholars who are interested in cutting-edge things. It's an even bigger frustration for the marketing and media communities that are using our work because they want to know, the day after Tumblr goes live as a platform, who's using it, how many, what are they doing, how are they different from every other kind of social media user? Well, we just don't know. So small groups like early adopters, small groups like subpopulations, that's part of the problem. A second thing is there are small activities that occur online. So there are ways in which many of you would like us to be able to parse different kinds of social media for different kind of activities. Do people use Twitter and Facebook in different ways? We're almost at a point where we can measure that, but we still can't slice the activities in quite the way that are most useful, which leaves a lot of territory for you guys. And it also means that only in rare instances do we actually ask about specific functions. We ask a general question about email use. We ask a general question about people getting news online. We ask a general question about people sharing links and stuff like that. But we don't talk to them by device, by platform, by application or activity and stuff. So there are limits in our data that relate to that. And then there are messy minds. When you're talking to people in phone surveys, you think you're being really smart and asking the question in exactly the way that every normal human being would be able to understand it and respond to it. Well, especially in an evolving space like this, that's just not so. I mean, one of the chronic frustrations with us almost from day one is we've never done a piece of work on net neutrality, because the terms are not well understood in the general public. To the degree that they're well understood, they're somewhat contested terms. I know I've reached out to a bunch of people in this room to help design some questions for some international studies we've done, but there are too many sort of different things going on in people's minds to sort of sort this out. And even in our data, there are frustrations. We think we've asked a straight-on question, and people don't necessarily know such things as whether they've gotten a piece of information from a .com or a .edu or a .gov. They don't know when they've moved from one site to another site, whether they're still in the domain of the original site that moved there. One of the first things I learned about the limits of our work is that men, surprisingly enough, are less likely to answer a question, "don't know." So you will ask them stuff and they will say, "Absolutely, I know this," or "I feel this," or "I think I do this," and women are a little bit more circumspect, but there are things like that that are sort of part of the human condition that we sort of can't account for. And the big limit of doing big national surveys is you can't get to the why questions. People can't explain themselves really well when you're asking them to say yes, no, or giving them maybe 3 or 4 options, because they will give you the kind of answers that Dana was getting. I don't want it, I don't need it, I don't like it, and stuff like that. When you begin to talk to people, they will say much more revealing things, but you can't do that on the phone because you're calling a stranger. And people are uncomfortable talking about their tech literacy skills or their language literacy skills or things that they don't know about how the world works. And so the sort of fundamental issue with the kind of survey work we do is why. So any answer that gets you towards why in the kind of research that you all are thinking about is in advance. That's a rare thing to be able to come out of survey work. And there are other things that are just beyond our data. And I would sort of categorize them. The most interesting ones that I always get asked about and can't give reasonable answers about involve some sort of alchemy between nature and nurture. And the 2 big ones that always come up are personal disclosure decisions. Everybody wants us to have good, useful, important data to help regulators think through privacy implications and stuff like that. Well, it turns out that the paradox in privacy findings is as obvious as it is long-standing. People say they value it. People act like they don't. It's not clear whether they know what's going wrong in the way that they're acting on their lives. It's not clear whether they're thinking about, I'm getting a transaction that actually matters more to me and is more efficient to me, so I'll let a piece of myself or my identity go out there. It's just really hard to sort out the balance of how people are making decisions about this stuff, partly because they're unaware and partly because in their transactional frame of mind, they can't necessarily talk very articulately about why I do what I do when I give up this kind of stuff. So we're going to actually spend a year doing much more qualitative work on this, because that's the real way that I think we'll be able to find stories about how context-driven disclosure decisions are, and more carefully sort out how aware people are of what the heck is going on in the first place. You know, our hypothesis is that the basic definition of privacy is what a lot of you have understood for a long time. People want to control their identity and control what happens to pieces of information about them, but we will have to use other methods to find that out. The other sort of mystery in our data is patterns of influence. You know, people would love us to be able to say social media accounts for X% of the value of somebody's vote, or whether someone made up their mind to vote, and traditional news media accounted for Y% and things like that. Well, people don't think that way. They don't often remember where they got key pieces of information. In many cases, in part because the online and offline worlds have merged so thoroughly in people's minds, they can't even tell you whether they got it in one of the digital devices they've got, or whether they have gotten it through a friend who tore out a news story for them. So they're, one of the great mysteries in our data, and one of the wonderful rare things that other methodologies are going to have to unearth, is the new contours of how influence is being felt in these new domains. Then there's a sort of a cluster, and I think Clive set a too high a standard for everybody in this room to try to understand everything rare that's going on. We can't. That's okay. But there are a couple of things that we see about group formation and group activities that strike me as relatively less well understood as other things, and they're emblematic by three things I'm going to talk about. One is the home concerts movement. You know, it's actually been going on for a while. Who's been to a home concert here? Okay, you guys are really with it. Well, it's the interplay between individual artists and their audiences, enabled by sort of digital promotion and digital awareness and sharing and sampling and things like that. People host concerts in their homes and invite their friends in, and this is the way lots of musical acts now sort of get their start or move to the next level of awareness. It's that wonderful interplay between creation and audience and how people find each other. That's a pretty new thing, and particularly in spaces where the transaction costs are at some level zero, but finding the right things and discovering the right things is kind of hard. A second phenomenon is just, I heard this yesterday and I looked it up, and it was the coolest thing I had heard in a while. There's a wonderful movement of green funeral home practices. That something happened a couple of years ago where some activists who cared a lot about the environment and thought, the way we were burying people was ridiculous in environmental terms. Well, it's sort of a merger between advocacy and a business opportunity and stuff like that. And there's now, if you do a search on green burials, you will find lots of funeral homes that offer this, and lots of ways that people are trying to make this a market differentiator for this work. So there are ways in which sort of new business formation and new business sensibilities and its intersection with activist groups is kind of new and kind of interesting, and we don't well understand it, but it's a phenomenon that is sort of rarely understood. And then there's another one that we at Pew Internet call communities that are essentially just in time, just like me communities. It's very evident in the rare disease community, where people who don't have a lot of contact with others who have the same condition or the same condition that a loved one has, they find each other, but there's something magical that happens at the moment that they find each other. Completely, often stranger encounters. These are not people who have lots of history together, who don't necessarily have any level of trust, going into the relationship, but to form an immediate bond. I'm dying for someone to coin the right word for how powerful these situations are when people discover someone who's going through the exact same thing that they are, in a circumstance where they've never met someone else like that. This is the Mobius syndrome website. One of the ways that we've heard about this is that Nell Minow, whom some of you might know as a corporate governance activist, has told us a wonderful story about her Uncle Bert, who had Mobius syndrome, which essentially paralyzes your face. And does potentially other things to you, but it's very hard for people with this condition to send out any kind of social signals apart from their speech. It's a quite debilitating, quite socially isolating kind of condition. And Nell talks about how her Uncle Bert became sort of the godfather of this movement when she introduced him to bulletin boards in the 1980s. And all of a sudden, he can describe encounter by encounter of how people who were suffering from the same thing all of a sudden found a soulmate on the other side of the country. And so something magic is happening there, and I would welcome anybody's insight into how that can be well understood. Then there's stuff that's hidden in the data, or stuff that we haven't extracted. So we know that in our data there are poor old people who are tech crazy. They use it a lot by every measure of use and enthusiasm and outcomes. They look exactly like well-educated, rich white folks. And so it's just rare because we haven't had much cause to quite go find them and promote them, because one of the most important things we do is keep moving on and gathering new data, but it's there. We also, by implication in our data, have things that speak to why people abandon their social network sites, or why people sort of transition from time to different levels of participation. So it's there. Who knows what motive is going on there. So my final word will be to invite you to play with our data. We are open source. All of our data sets from all of our surveys from March 2000 to now, it's about 150 surveys, are available for people to download and play with however they want. So steal our data and help us tell these stories. Thank you very much. Questions? And I'd really love, at some point, I meant it today, I'd love to hear from folks about what we should be doing, because we've got a lot to do, and I'd like to be really useful to you guys. Yeah.
So a hidden story kind of that you don't really mention is you talk about the limitations of coverage, but some of that's resource-driven, right?
Yeah.
And there are other projects like the General Social Survey and other large national representative surveys that use face-to-face interviewing techniques. They're not maybe as responsive because it's a slower method, but they do more coverage. And it's largely, you're talking about a trade-off between the resources behind the survey and what you can actually accomplish with the survey.
Right. Well, and the other thing that in the future, one of the stories that maybe you all are painfully aware of, probably as painfully as I am, surveys are in deep trouble. Right? Right now, the standard response rate that we're getting now is about half of what it was at the dawn of the project. For the political stuff that we all relied on and made so much use of and was so important to the last campaign, those response rates are middle single digits. Even with extra effort to try to get more people into them, and so the caller ID has not been our friend. And we're doing lots of survey work with mobile devices, because we can the registries that pollsters use to talk to people are just as robust now for mobile devices as they are for landline devices. So that's not the issue. It's just people won't answer the calls. And for the first time in some of our data, as we try to figure out who's not answering our surveys, for the first time this year, as we did special analysis, we find that the people who answer surveys are much more civically oriented, much more likely to be volunteers, sort of slightly more likely to be politically engaged. They aren't different politically. In other words, surveys are still quite good for predicting election outcomes if they're done well. But the sort of social character and community spiritedness of people who don't answer surveys seems to be different, and that's going to be a problem as we keep moving forward, because one of the great things that the GSS has done for forever, and that work like ours done on a much smaller scale, is figure out what's going on in civic life and how people get information and act in civic life, and so there's a pretty intense discussion in the polling fraternity about how to cope with this. Yeah.
Related to that, if there is a survey fatigue, and if some of that is because there's a private sector now that's deeply invested in constantly asking people, what do you think, what do you want? Has there been any move to see more collaboration of sharing data that's generated by maybe marketing services? Or what are the opportunities?
Yeah. We're definitely, one of the chronic problems that we've had for a long time, but it's intensified in recent years, is people always think we're telemarketers. The first encounter with a strange number on the phone is somebody says, we're taking a survey, and then we have to do one of those drug condition voiceovers, and we're not telling you anything, please keep talking to us, don't hang up. And sometimes we can convince them to do it, and sometimes not. But so there are definitely ways that we're seeing other problems or other issues in the marketplace get wrapped up in our work, even though there are sort of legal carve-outs. We're the political and civic polling and nonprofit polling enterprise has lots of permission under the law that telemarketers don't. But there is some thought about polling resources. Of course, it's still a competitive space, and there's the other thing, just to be brutal about it, is there's a lot of junk out there. There's stuff masquerading as representative samples of polls that just isn't, and so finding the right partners is very much sort of a contest, and we still don't. Pew wants to do its own thing sometimes too, so that's a big challenge. Yeah.
That was great. It's rare that you get to hear somebody speak to the limits of their data sets and the notes. I really appreciate you doing that. Sort of to build on Mary's point, I was looking at your list, small groups, small activities, emergent activities, that's all of what I look at. So when we were trying to design a nationally representative survey that we're targeting 14 to 16-year-olds and blah, 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 we were just told that there was just no way we could do it. So I really feel the pain of that. And so we ended up designing what we would like to call a nationally representative survey, but isn't by your standards, where we're doing targeted recruitment through specific sites like schools and community programs that serve the populations that we're interested in. And then you know better than I do how to deal with all the waiting and stuff like that.
But it actually, Pew has similar interests and does similar things. We've done some very specialized work with understanding Muslims in America, and there are lots of ways that you have to sort of, change the standard rules to get the kind of population samples.
Actually, my question is sort of both from a Pew perspective, because a lot of the questions that this community is interested in is about emerging phenomena that haven't hit the national numbers that you need for a more traditional sampling technique. Is Pew doing, we're interested in experimentation that way, or are there ways that we can collaborate or link data sets up that you've seen that are creative, that are doing these more targeted or opportunistic samples versus the kind of sampling that you were focused on your talk?
You know what? You're just suggesting something that's possible, and I don't think ever been attempted. There's a poll data repository at the University of Connecticut called the Roper Center, named after Elmo Roper, and it pulls together. It's a vault for lots of polling. As far as I know, linking data sets in that has never been attempted, and there's no way I can think of that would prevent it. It's very structured data. We all ask kind of the same questions in the same ways. We might have to rename variables, but that part of it's not hard. The other thing that we've done at times when we really care about a population and have had trouble finding it through standard methods, which are enormously expensive, is to sort of backfill with data from the knowledge networks. And now GfK has a really great, robust panel and they know a lot about their members, and it's a panel, so that you've got to worry a little bit about not only one side is survey fatigue, but another side is professional survey responders. People who have signed up to sort of be on a panel and sort of say, yeah, I'll do 10 surveys a year, why not? So yeah, we should probably talk more about how to do that, but absolutely, that's a great idea. Yeah.
You mentioned this, but wasn't one of the things that was so out of whack about that election polling, that the use of the phone itself, and if you're looking at emerging sort of smaller groups, some of these groups may not have a landline or something. I mean, isn't the use, you're saying like, getting people with caller ID is a problem? My assumption was that was actually a big problem in the election.
It was one of the problems in the election, trying to reach special populations that probably were decisive in some congressional districts or state races or even the national race, and it's part of that cell phone driven. We're still happy, and actually we're happier than we thought we'd be with the mobile phone collection. It works about as well as landline. We're getting, the registries are as good so that if you have a cell phone, you have as much chance to be called by us as any other cell phone owner in the country. A new weighting variable that's been added to surveys, which has actually made them better, is your phone use status. Because one of the best surveys that's done, against which we true up our stuff in our weighting sample, is done by the CDC, where they talk to people about not only do you have a cell phone, do you have a landline phone, but if you have both, which do you make most of your calls on? And these numbers are so solid that that's now one of the things that we use for our weighting. So that's not so much the issue. The issue, for the best polling that was done in the campaign, non-response rates didn't seem to matter. The problem is that, even for Nate Silver, he was combining, gold standard polls like ours and a couple of others with stuff that wasn't necessarily gold standard, and it came out okay. So aggregating does do good work. And the other thing that he really introduced to the conversation that was so important was understanding probabilities. I mean, he just changed it by himself. He changed the nature of the discourse by doing that. And the fact that he did it well means that in the future, that's now going to become at least part of the smarter political commentary that emerges from polling. Okay, thanks.